Anastasia. In general, signs are present today and continue to work, but people lack knowledge about them. Rigdon. Perfectly true. This is the result mankind has arrived at. It is not only the knowledge that has been lost, but even the semantic meaning of the words that certain symbols and signs meant as a complex. Here is a simple example. Let us consider, for instance, the word symbol, which is currently used in everyday life by the Russian-speaking population. It is borrowed from the Greek language. But how did it appear in ancient Greece? In ancient Greece, there existed such a word as shma, meaning a sign, a banner, a heavenly sign. It should be noted that the ancient cultures of the Aegean region, even before Greece appeared, especially after those peoples came into contact with the Eastern peoples, for instance, with the inhabitants of Anatolia, now the territory of Turkey, and with the ancient Egyptians, who had developed sacred writings and occult knowledge. Much of the knowledge of the invisible world was explained by means of the allegories understandable to the inhabitants of a certain region. For example, the process and the results of a joint meditation of a group of people who were working with signs, or for a specific setting of a working sign that influenced the masses, were explained to the initiate newcomers simply by using associations they could easily understand. The area of influence the sign covered was associatively compared to casting a net into the sea by fishermen, for the profession of a fisherman was very popular in those times. They were told that if the sign was set in a certain place, for instance in a room, temple, or in the square, it would influence the people within this space. Roughly speaking, like a net set in a certain part of the sea during fishing. In short, in ancient times they used such allegories which the people of that era could understand. Today, of course, all this can be explained to people using modern examples. For instance, the influence of certain signs and symbols can be compared to the radio receiver that operates at a predetermined frequency and distributes radio waves to certain distances, or to the light of the street lamp which illuminates a certain part of the street. And even then, these will still be allegories, because modern people are also very far from understanding the phenomena related to the processes taking place in other dimensions. So then, it is precisely due to such associative comparison, which was common in secret societies, that the word to symbolon appeared in everyday lexicon of people who, as the Russian proverb says, heard the song but got it wrong, and this word started to mean a group practice of several fishermen casting nets when fishing. Well, it's the same old story. Those who know nothing about the spiritual side of the matter always equate the meaning of the knowledge they have heard to objects and phenomena of the material world, based on their material understanding. But at the same time, this word to symbolon continued to be used by people initiated into the knowledge. As a result, along with the more ancient word shma, meaning a sign, a banner, a heavenly sign, the word symbol came to be used in the following meanings: joining the invisible with the visible, locating the invisible reality through a visible sign, the secret meaning of which is understood only by a certain group of people. And later on, symbol totally replaced this ancient word. It is also important to know how the archons react to the growing popularity among people of knowledge that came from secret spiritual societies. I shall once again use the word symbol as an example. When this word began to gain significance among the population precisely in its primordial meaning, the Freemasons interfered in this matter. They began to establish on the territory of Greece their different guilds, corporations, societies, religions, parties, and to place their signs and symbols as public signs of distinction of these organizations. They began to soil the word symbol with the semantic meaning of ordinary human matters, use it in various aspects of everyday life, as diplomatic agreements, as tickets to the theater, as names of signet rings of the Athenian judges, and as the name of a share of monetary membership contribution. As a result, the primordial meaning of the word symbol came to be forgotten and began to disappear from everyday use. However, interestingly enough, the word symbol came into the Russian language exactly in the meaning of sign, and the word sign, znak, originated in the Russian language from the Old Slavonic word to know and to have information about something, the Old Russian and Ukrainian word znati, the Slovenian znati, the Old Czech znati, the Polish znać, and so on. That is, the word znać, to know, was clear to any Slav, regardless of the existing differences in languages. As a matter of fact, in some sense, it reflected exactly the original meaning of the Greek word symbol. So this is just one of the many examples of transformation of the word that means sign and symbol. Actually, every nationality had their own definitions of a sign and a symbol, but not every nation today remembers their original meanings. If people had known these original meanings, they would be surprised how identical in meaning they are among the different peoples which in the ancient times lived at considerable distances from each other and were separated by oceans. Clearly, it is difficult for people to advance in cognizing the issue of symbols and signs without having the primary basis of the knowledge, thanks to which one can view the overall situation over millennia. But this can be corrected. Thus, there exist several working signs which have constantly been present in human society, regardless of whether the current generation of people knows about them or not. There is also basic knowledge of other signs and symbolism. From the earliest times, the latter were the bearers of certain encoded knowledge about the human being, his energy structure, and also his abilities in the invisible world, including the main one, spiritual liberation. Since ancient times, the basic signs and symbols have been placed according to specific purposes, depending on their use. In some cases, this was a transfer of knowledge, while in others, they were placed as an element of direct influence upon the one looking at them. When the goal was to pass on the knowledge, signs and symbols were drawn by the type of seal. I shall explain using a simple example. When a person looks at his photograph, the right side of the photograph corresponds to his left hand, whereas the left side of the photograph corresponds to his right hand. It is the same thing on the seal when you look at the original and compare it with its impression. The same applies to the signs related to transfer of the knowledge, especially the ones designating the right and the left essences. Whereas if signs and symbols were intended for exerting a certain influence on the person looking at them, they were placed strictly according to the actual sides. For example, if it was necessary to activate the right essence of man, then the corresponding sign or symbol was placed in front of the right side of the person looking at them, and so on. There were many other nuances on how to read these signs, which were already invented by people, from left to right or from right to left, from top to bottom, or vice versa. But this is already specificity related to the local traditions of different ancient peoples, although it too, in its turn, was based on certain information. But we're not talking about that now. Let us consider the basic knowledge about the four essences of a human and the soul, which has been known to people since ancient times. Originally, designation of an ordinary human being was in the form of an equilateral cross with a circle in the center. A simplified version was simply an equilateral cross. The horizontal line of the cross designated connection with matter, while the vertical line meant the connection with the spiritual world, or rather it indicated the presence of elements from the spiritual world in a human and the possibility of spiritual elevation. That is why, as a matter of fact, different peoples subsequently associated the horizontal line with the element of earth, with the material, earthly world, inward movement, and also with time, as movement from the past to the future, a vector, west-east, and with the line separating heaven and earth, while the vertical line was associated with the elements of fire and air and their initial upward direction from the material sphere to the spiritual one. The four-pointed structure of an equilateral cross and a circle inside it, the four main essences and the soul, denoted the principal elements in the human structure, which embodied the main plan, creation of conditions for a personality's choice between the material and the spiritual world. The circle is an ancient symbol of the soul or of a manifestation from the spiritual world, including a spiritual being, a symbol of God's presence, a designation of the sacred sound of Ra. This is a circumference which symbolically bound and contained within itself a part of the great void. Given that the soul is true antimatter, that is a force coming from the spiritual world, then in the understanding of the material thinking, it is nothing. Sometimes it was depicted as a dot in the center of a circle, as a symbol of concentrated energy from the spiritual world. In some cases, this was the designation for the initial stage of spiritual development or awakening, and the circle itself symbolized spiritual powers, a characteristic of the soul in the meaning of perfection, wholeness, constancy, eternity, a designation of the spiritual world, an existence which has neither beginning nor end. There is another remarkable fact. In the human structure, the soul is surrounded by information shells, subpersonalities, but all this is also enclosed in a shell consisting of life energy of a human, prana. It is prana that is a kind of an interlayer between the energy of the soul and the material world. In the mythology of the peoples of the world, especially where such sacred, spiritual knowledge about man was reflected, an associative parallel was often drawn between the energy of prana and fire characteristics of the sun, hence designation of the soul as a solar disk. The circle also denoted demarcation of the two spheres, the material and the spiritual. When it came to the knowledge about a human, this pointed to information about the soul being, so to speak, in the intermediate state. Sometimes, together with the circle, elements were depicted that gave it dynamics. For instance, wings, lotus petals, rays, winding snakes, or tongues of flame. Such images can be found in the sacred symbols of Tripilia, ancient Indian, ancient Egyptian, ancient Mexican, Sumerian, and ancient Russian cultures. This meant the spiritual growth of man or indicated spiritual knowledge, teaching, introduced into this world by a being from the spiritual world. It also showed the direction of movement from the inside to the outside, which is a characteristic of the power of the soul that pushes the personality towards a choice and the search of spiritual ways for liberation from the captivity of matter. Often in cosmological myths, the ancients enclosed the general scheme of the world in a circle. In such a case, this pointed to creation, formation of the material world by the spiritual world. Anastasia. Yes, knowledge about the sacred meaning of the circle is recorded in the symbols and signs not only of rock drawings and frescoes on house walls, but also of archaeological objects, sacred sculptures, ritual clothing, ceramics, and so on. They have also been preserved in the architecture of ancient temple buildings and simple dwellings, marquees and yurts. Traditional ritual acts of certain beliefs also reflect this knowledge. For instance, ritual walking in a circle around a certain territory or a building, performance of circular dances, ritual circle dances around an invisible center or fire, a sacred place, spinning of shamans and dervishes, and solemn sitting of sages in a circle to communicate, where the center of the circle was empty, not filled with anything, as a symbol of the spiritual nature. Rigdon. By the way, in ancient times, people would build their towns similarly. That is, they would place buildings in them exactly in a circle, leaving the center of the town also empty, not built up, in the form of a round square. First and foremost, such a building plan had deep sacred meaning. Anastasia. Modern cities obviously lack this, although archaeological examples of such ancient buildings are in existence today. For example, thousands of years ago, such a principle was used for building settlements of the Tripolian civilization in the Danube and Dnieper interfluve. In the same way, cities were built based on the prototype of Archaim in the ancient Urals. For instance, the so-called by archaeologists Santashta culture, the country of towns, which was discovered by archaeologists on the territory of Russia, Chelyabinsk Oblast, Orenburg Oblast, Bashkortostan, and northern Kazakhstan. Rigdon. Exactly so. But let us go back to the ancient symbol of a human being, an equilateral cross with a circle in the center. The lines of the cross represent the four essences of a human. The lateral essences, the horizontal lines coming from the center, the back essence, the vertical line going down from the center, and the front essence, the vertical line going up from the center. As I have already said, in associative comparisons, the characteristics of these essences were attributed to certain forces in space. For example, the four elements, the four seasonal winds, and also the four cardinal directions. At that, three forces were usually closely interconnected with each other or had negative characteristics of the back and the lateral essences. And the fourth was the leading one, very special in its properties, and had positive characteristics of the front essence. All these forces were also designated with a cross, which is the sacred symbol of a human being, as one whose structure combines spirit and matter. The vertical line of the cross was associated with the solstice, the movement towards the spiritual world, with the human's aspiration for the spiritual nature to prevail in him. That is why on the head of sacred gods in the religious traditions of the ancient peoples of the world, a solar disk was often depicted as a symbol of supremacy of the spiritual nature and of knowledge introduced from the spiritual world. The horizontal line, indicating the lateral essences, was allegorically called the axis of equinox, associating it with the movement of the sun, when the sun crosses the celestial equator at the vernal and autumnal equinoxes. Anastasia. Yes, this can be traced even now by monuments of the ancient culture. For example, a very interesting bas-relief has been preserved in the ancient Persian city of Persepolis. There also exists its more ancient name, which when translated from the Persian language means the throne of Jamshid. It depicts a symbol of the Zoroastrian New Year holiday Navruz, which the Persian, Iranian, and the Turkic people celebrate in accordance with the solar calendar. So the most interesting thing is that this symbol is a bull, the right essence, and a lion, the left essence, eternally fighting each other. In ancient times, it was believed that on certain days of the year, their powers became equal. Rigdon: that is right. This is exactly why later on people began to link these symbols to days of the solar equinox in nature, although all this has a different underlying message. The secret meaning of the knowledge about the four essences of a human also went into the notions that were equivalent to the cross. Anastasia: majority of modern people associate the cross only with one world religion, Christianity. In turn, ministers of this religion do their utmost to prevent people from being interested in anything greater. After all, the cross is a very ancient symbol, and it had appeared long before the emergence of this religion. Images of crosses and their modifications have been known since the Paleolithic period. For example, a symbol of the cross was found on the monuments dated to the time of the primitive society. Let us take, for instance, images of the Chauvet cave, France, which are 20,000 years old and which have been very well preserved thanks to the microclimate of the cave. Rigdon: and even then, it should be mentioned that these discoveries have been made relatively recently. And how many more of such places exist which are still unknown to mankind as of today? But such artifacts are valuable only when people understand the primordial meaning of symbols, and not just admire the amazing art of the ancients, linking these designations with concepts from the human mind, which are imposed by modern religions. Different variations of the cross symbolically indicated additional information to its main interpretation. For example, if the tips of the cross had three spheres, that indicated the three-dimensionality of the world where the human being resided, or it represented a numerical characteristic of the phenomena that were denoted in the form of an additional sign on the cross. If the lower part of a cross, which corresponded to the back essence, was elongated, the so-called long or Latin cross, that meant focus of attention, concentration on the back essence, continuous suffering, a reminder of the past that burdened the soul, stimulation of the sense of guilt and resentment. As you already understand, if a person is in the state of the animal nature, such an activation of the back essence is in fact constant stimulation of depression, fear, and self-blame. Anastasia: at that, Christian believers are imposed upon to wear this particular form of a cross, supposedly as a symbol of Christ's sufferings. So does this mean that instead of love for God, people are indirectly looped on the thoughts about their suffering, the past, and death? In other words, with this symbol, they subconsciously activate in people negativity related to nothing else but their own past? So this is actually nothing more than a stimulation of the activation of the back essence. Rigdon: this is exactly one of the elements we have already discussed. I mean manipulations with signs and temples. And in this case, not only the back essence has been emphasized. As a rule, the reverse of such a cross has the following inscription in the Latin letters: INRI, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Iuderum, which means Jesus of Nazareth, the king of Judea. Anastasia, I see they even hammer into the subconscious of believers the supremacy of a certain people over them. And why is there no symbol of the soul here, of love for God? Rigdon with a smile. Well, as you see, when a person has knowledge, he starts asking questions that are inconvenient for the priests in power. How can they place such a symbol if the aims and objectives, according to their big books, are entirely different? They speak of soul salvation only in theory meant for the masses, but in reality, you see for yourself what is going on. Anastasia. Yes, unfortunately, in practice, in contrast to theory, nobody has abolished slavery. They have simply perfected and camouflaged it well as democratic liberty, having thus created a mere illusion of freedom and equality.